So I was diagnosed with autism at the age of 3, and to be honest, I never felt bad about it. I just never thought about it. Like, my parents told me from the very beginning that I was autistic. I never felt any particular way about it. And that is down to the privilege of having grown up in a family that's very neurodiverse affirming. My needs as a neurodivergent child were met. Like, my parents did a very good job of making sure that my environment was a home environment that an autistic child could thrive in. So everyone who was involved in bringing me up, at least in the family, did a fantastic job of making sure that I never felt like a burden or that I was any less for being autistic. I was schooled in a mainstream school, so that is to say a school that doesn't cater to disabled people specifically, just a normal school that most people go to. But by the age of 6 or 7, I began to struggle in the mainstream system because the mainstream system couldn't provide me the resources that I needed as a neurodivergent ADHD and autistic child. I very quickly outstripped their resources, and it got to the point where my mom had to start looking for other schooling arrangements for me. And that's when she found a special needs education school, which was a school tailor-made for autistic kids, basically, that they could go to and have their needs catered for specifically, which sounded fantastic, because that's kind of exactly what I needed. I needed a school that could deal with me being ADHD and autistic and the needs that came along with that. So by the age of about 6.5, 7, I got enrolled to this school. And by this point, I was a very confident, outgoing, expressive, very hyper, and very all over the place kind of kid. I was into everything. I was very loud and colorful and full of life. It's kind of sad because it was at this point in my life where that began to disappear, and it got replaced with a kid who was a lot more scared, a lot more anxious, and a lot more self-conscious, and certainly a lot more panicky. And this was down to the behavior of the teachers at the school. The teachers of the school were very much under the impression that because they had been trained in special needs education, that they knew everything about autism, that textbook autism, so to speak, was how every autistic person presents, and their needs are all the same, and anyone who differs from that is invalid and will not be catered for, was essentially the attitude of everyone at that school for the most part. And therefore it meant that a lot of us had our needs dismissed a lot of the time, and a lot of us were very much made to feel that nothing we ever did was good enough, because none of our needs were ever being met, and therefore we struggled, and then we'd get blamed for struggling because by their perception we weren't trying hard enough, and it was just a horrible cycle. And it gave a lot of us really serious breakdowns later in life. So a good example of this was my maths teacher in class 3 when I was about 7 or 8. I had a lesson on tens and units. I'd sat down, tried to listen as best I could, but I couldn't really grasp the concept fully, and I wasn't very confident with it. She gave us a worksheet at the end of this lesson for us all to sit down and try, and I remember sitting down at my table and writing through my worksheet and trying my best. But I was quite slow, and which is a struggle that is often associated with being autistic or ADHD. Time management skills are definitely not our strong suit a lot of the time. And this is certainly a problem for me, but it wasn't only that either. I was also struggling with the concept, and I didn't know exactly how to do it. So I was trying to take it slow so I could figure it out. And I remember the teacher was walking around the class looking at us all and seeing if any of us needed help, which I clearly did. But she came over to me and she saw me working slowly, and she went, come on, work faster, come on, you won't be finished with this worksheet by the end of the lesson if you don't work faster. So I speed up, I do as I'm told. And as a result, I sacrifice accuracy, I sacrifice understanding, and I get confused and make a lot of mistakes. So at the very end of the lesson, she ends up marking everyone's work, and she comes to my sheet and she crosses everything off as incorrect. You've been rushing. You've rushed too much. Look at this is all wrong. You've rushed it. You need to take your time more so you can understand it. And this was a very common occurrence at the school. You were always told one thing, and then you would often get told off for doing the exact thing that you were told to do, which I was told to speed up. So being a very literal person, I sped up. I didn't really think to say, well, I'm struggling, because I was just told to speed up, so I sped up. And I did say, well, I was struggling, I didn't understand. And she was like, well, maybe if you'd have been a bit slower, you'd have figured it out. It's like, well, I was trying to be slow. Things like this were very common. This was not an isolated incident, and this would happen many more times over my time at the school. And this was the start of my attitude towards myself and the beliefs towards myself becoming quite negative. And this is when I began to realize that, in my head at the time anyway, being autistic was a bad thing, because I knew that I was at that school because I had extra educational needs, as it was put. But I saw that as a bad thing because the teachers only ever treated it as a bad thing for the most part. I felt like a burden because of it. I felt like I wasn't good enough, that I was inadequate, and that I wasn't smart, that I could never accomplish anything. Anyway, fast forward 2 or 3 years, I now have panic disorder. I'm having panic attacks every single day. My self-esteem is at rock bottom, at an all-time low, and I am struggling hardcore to stay at school all day, every day. I often can't manage it. I have to go home a lot of the time by this point. Things had gotten so bad that the head teacher had to come up with a system for me to help me with my panic disorder. And this was the red card system. So I had this red card in my pocket that all of the teachers had been trained on, which basically had meant that I could show this card to the teacher in any lesson, in any situation, to get out of it and go to the deputy head teacher's office to go home. On this particular day, I had a sports lesson. I had this particular sports teacher was going to teach us football, or about football. And I showed up to this lesson on this day feeling very anxious. And I could feel in my body a lot of anxiety. I was feeling quite shaky, but I felt like I could probably stay in school if I could just not do the sports lesson, because I thought this is too much for me right now. I need to break off from this. So I walk up to this sports teacher and I show her my red card and say, "I'm sorry, I can't do this today." And she went, "Get changed." And I was like, "But I'm not well enough to do this today. I can't do this." And she went, "Stop being so dramatic and get changed." So she completely broke the red card rule, basically. So I end up going into the changing rooms, changing into my sports gear, and we begin playing football. Everything's fine for the first couple of minutes, but as time goes on, I get more and more shaky, and because of my dyspraxia, I have poor spatial awareness, and I can be quite clumsy, especially when I'm anxious. And the anxiety gets more and more and more. I'm feeling more and more overwhelmed. Eventually, I end up tripping on the football, and I end up falling onto the ground with all my body weight onto my right arm. So I smack onto the floor, and the teacher says, "Oh, for God's sake." And then she says, like, "Sit down for 5 minutes." So I sit down for 5 minutes, feeling so much worse for this, and to be honest, dissociating by this point. After the 5-minute break, she tells me, "Get back out there." And I say, "No, I really can't. I am not feeling well. I can't go back out there." And then she says, "Stop being such a drama queen and get back out there." So I do that. I get back up and I go back out there and continue playing, only for me to fall over again. But this time it was so much worse. And it was that bad that the entire right side of my arm had gone black. It was that bad that when I'd gotten home, I had to go to hospital with my mom to get it checked over to make sure that I hadn't broken my arm. My mom obviously reports this to the school because I was very upset and very hurt, obviously, and she was very alarmed at how I'd been treated. As was very common with the teachers at the school, she had been given a pass for this and it was all fine on her end. She ended up taking me aside a couple of days later after this, and she told me, like, "If there's ever anything wrong, you must tell me. Like, I'm here to help. If there's ever anything wrong, you're ever not feeling well, you can tell me, you know that, right?" Which is like insanely frustrating. And at the time, as a kid, I didn't realize that was gaslighting. Looking back, there were so many situations at the school that were like that. It was very commonplace for the autistic kids at the school to experience something bad, relate it to their parents, and their parents complain to the school, and then the school host a meeting between the teacher and the parents, only for the teacher to lie about whatever it was that had happened and say, "Oh, no, they misinterpreted it. It wasn't that at all. Like, they're autistic. They struggle with, social cues. It's fine. No, it wasn't actually like that. It was like this." And it would all be put down to a misunderstanding of the autistic child that doesn't understand anything that's going on. And then, it would be a pat on the head for the autistic child. "Oh, you silly, you didn't get that," or whatever, It was a very common experience at the school, and it happened to me multiple times. Very fortunately for me, my parents knew that it wasn't like that and they saw right through it. But nonetheless, it did a hell of a lot of damage to me. So fast forward a year or two after this, and I end up coming out of school to be homeschooled, because by this point, the panic disorder had gotten so much worse. I was barely spending any time in school anyway. Like, my mental health was just completely in tatters by the age of like 11 or 12. So it was not worth me continuing school by this point. I was medically signed off by my doctor because of it. But by this point, a lot of the damage to my psyche had already been done. I already had rock bottom self-esteem. I already hated myself for being autistic and for having needs, for struggling so much. The teachers at the school had taught me that having needs was bad, being vulnerable was bad, and that asking for help would be a dangerous thing to do. This very much gave me the blueprint as an adolescent and as a teenager to feel like I was fundamentally unattractive, that I was fundamentally unappealing because of being autistic, that I would never amount to anything, that I could never learn anything because I felt stupid. I felt like I would never be able to learn anything because of my experiences at school, because I'd associated struggling or not doing too well with something with being fundamentally incapable of it because of how the teachers had treated me. And it was at this time that I ended up really internalizing a lot of the negative thoughts that I had about being autistic within me. I had a lot of shame about it. As I become more self-aware, as teenagers do, I began feeling grossed out by being autistic, by being disabled, by not being able to do things that quote-unquote normal kids were able to do. And this culminated into social anxiety as well, where I ended up feeling like everything that I did, that I said, whatever it was, had to be put through a filter, which is where masking comes from a lot of us, as I'm sure a lot of you autistic folks out there know. By this point, I had just become a shell of a person that felt like they had to hide everything about themselves to interact with other people, to be acceptable, to be, lovable even. I hated being autistic. I hated having all these issues, and I just wanted to be like everyone else. And it wasn't till my early 20s during the pandemic when this changed. That was when I learned about the term ableism. It was a massive light bulb moment for me, because when I learned about that phrase, immediately it was like sparks had gone off in my head. All of a sudden, I had context for those experiences that I had as a child. Those teachers were ableist. Abusive and ableist. They made me feel lesser for being disabled. They made me feel lesser for having needs. That's where I began my journey of unpacking a lot of the internalized shame that I had about being autistic. That's when I started to recognize that actually I am disabled, and it is completely okay to struggle with the things that I struggle with. Even more so, that my struggles aren't my fault. It's just the world is a really hard place for neurodivergent and disabled people to live in, and it often makes us feel like we're lesser for it. I guess this is where a lot of my grief started to ensue, because when I began to put all these experiences that I had into context, I realized how hostile the world could be towards us, how people can take our vulnerability and completely stamp on us with it. And it was a very difficult process to go through, because I had to shoulder all of that pain that I hadn't fully processed or understood and integrate it, figure out how to move forward with it, but also not have it hold me back, because I had built a lot of very maladaptive coping mechanisms with this. It had caused me to dissociate constantly, which is something that I'm still dealing with even today. It had caused me trouble with connecting with other people, with dating, with making friends and getting out there and trying new things, learning new things. It had stopped me from doing so many things, and I had to kind of reconcile the internalized ableism. I had to reconcile the social anxiety. I had to improve my self-esteem to get to a place where I could connect with other people properly, to get to a place where I could learn new things without panicking when I got things wrong. I did get there with a lot of these things, but even today I'm still working on a lot of this. It's a very long and complicated road. And you definitely can get there. I've been doing this for about 3 or 4 years now, and I feel like I'm finally in a place where I'm starting to see the fruits of my labor. I'm beginning to see that actually I can move past this and I can recover from this. But ultimately, a lot of us as neurodivergent people, at least speaking as an autistic neurodivergent person, a lot of us have CPTSD. In fact, I'm willing to wager that a vast majority of us are traumatized because of the world that we grow up in. The world makes you feel like you're a bad person, or that you're lesser for being disabled, for having needs that are contrary to the needs of most neurotypical people, for instance. This has a really negative impact on your nervous system. The experiences that I had in my school had taught me that I shouldn't listen to how I feel. I shouldn't listen to what my experiences are, because they're wrong. Because of the gaslighting experiences that I had, I always felt like my judgment couldn't be listened to. That made life very difficult for me. I was constantly second guessing the things that I was saying, the things that I was doing, the things that I had experienced, which actually often primes us for very abusive relationships and friendships with people, because it means that the lessons that we learn as younger kids will teach us to ignore red flags in other people because of that, because we don't trust our judgment enough. Now, I'm very happy to say that I've been able to move past those patterns now, and while I'm not perfect and I'm still improving, I'm doing a lot better than I was, and I've made a ton of progress, especially in the last 2 or 3 years. And I'm beginning to, as a result of this, discover, new needs that I didn't even know that I had. For instance, since learning about autism more and integrating it into my identity, I have taken the sensory side of things more seriously. So for example, a new need that I discovered more recently was that bright lights really bother me. From a sensory perspective, I find it very difficult. And I didn't realize this until I'd turned off the big light in my flat the one night, and I'd just had a lamp on in the corner. And I realized how much relief I had when I turned off that big light, and the lighting was just a lot more dim and a lot less overstimulating. And I realized how much more comfortable I'd felt. And the same went for when I had noise-cancelling headphones for the first time. I remember when I put them on when I was out in public for the first time, and I put noise-cancelling on. I remember the relief I felt when I couldn't hear anything. And it was just nothing. I felt a sense of relief that I didn't even realize that I needed. So yeah, that has been my journey with ableism in the school system and how it's impacted me as an adult. I would be so curious to hear about your experiences in school with ableism or in the education system in general. I would love to hear about them down in the comments below, so please do feel free to share down in the comments if you want to. And maybe we can have a little discussion about how it's affected us down there. I would love to hear your thoughts. And if you like this video, please give it a like. And if you want to see more of this kind of content, please subscribe. I have more ideas coming up soon, and I will see you in the next one.